Hey, how's it going, everybody? It's Timothy here with Mana Rocks, and we are going to jump into part 4 of our Ikoria archetype breakdown. We've got this video left. In addition to one other, we will cover graveyard decks in this video, and we will cover human decks in the next video, which should be two pretty straightforward, simple archetypes that most people would be able to figure out, but I wanted to talk about some of the nuance and just, due diligence and make sure we talked about all of the major archetypes. Also note there's a 5-color archetype probably floating around this set, similar to Khans of Tarkir, but I don't know how prevalent it's going to be. People love to play 5 colors, so that is going to be a thing, but I don't know if we need to dedicate an entire video to it or not. Again, as always, if you've been enjoying this content, if you found this useful, informative, anything, feel free to subscribe below, like the video, leave a comment if you will, or find us on Twitter at MTG_ManaRocks. And without further ado, let's talk about some graveyard synergy. So the first thing this set would have you believe, if you looked at the gold cards, is that the graveyard decks are in multiple different colors, and while that's kind of true, it's basically green-black deck, right? If you're going to be a graveyard deck, you're going to be green-black, and then you're going to branch out into a separate color as potentially a splash if you have any of the gold cards that really incentivize you to do so. So again, this is more of like just advice rather than a hard and set rule that if you are, drafting some of the black-white graveyard matters cards, some of the gold payoffs or what have you, you probably want to try and shift into green-black and then make that white mana a splash. And the reason this is a little confusing is because 2 of the 3-color archetypes or 3-color cards in this set seem to signal towards being Graveyard Matters cards, or definitely are Graveyard Matters cards, but include a 3rd color, right? So 2 of the Apex creatures here do exactly what I'm talking about. The first one is Nethroi, Apex of Death. This is the 5-mana Abzan Apex. It's a 5/5 lifelink death touch creature. Mythic, Catmare Night Beast. Cat Nightmare Beast. And it says whenever this creature mutates, return any number of target creature cards with total power 10 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Just a completely absurd ability. Just being able to reanimate 2, 3, 4, maybe even creatures whenever you mutate this thing is just ridiculous, in my opinion. Plus, it's a good vanilla creature, right? 5 mana, 5/5 Death Touch lifelink. The thing about this card, it has white in its mana cost. It has kind of white in its mutate cost, but notice that the mutate cost has hybrid white mana. It's green-white hybrid mana, so you can technically play this card in a deck with 0 white sources and still be able to mutate it. You won't be able to actually cast the card, so you'll want to splash white to give yourself that option, but you can play this in a straight-up green-black deck without ever having to care about having white mana. And this is about as good of a payoff as you can get for filling up your graveyard with creatures. It's just completely absurd and broken card, as is the case with most of the Apexes. The other one is Brokos, Apex of Forever, which is similar, it's a green-black base creature, but it's also got that random blue symbol in there, and there's not really a Sultai Graveyard Matters theme, right? Everything that cares about the graveyard in the set is basically centered in green-black, with the exception of maybe 1 or 2 cards. So if you are going to first pick a Brokos, and you really want to start digging into the graveyard synergy, you need to stick to green-black as much as possible and make that blue a splash. Plus, this has the same hybrid going on in its mutate cost as Nethroi, right? You can pay 2 black, green, blue to just cast Brokos as a 6/6 trampler, or you can mutate for 2 green, green, and then a split blue-black mana, a hybrid mana, right? So again, you don't have to have blue in your deck to mutate this. You can just pay 2 black, green, green to mutate this. And in addition to that, the thing that makes this a graveyard synergy card is that Brokos may be cast from the graveyard using its mutate ability. So you can always mutate this from the graveyard onto some non-human you control, meaning Brokos just comes back over and over and over again unless it gets exiled. And there are not actually a lot of ways to exile Brokos. So very powerful card. Not as rawly powerful as Nethroi, right? If I had somehow the option between these 2 cards as a first pick, I'm taking Nethroi every time, but Brokos is still very powerful in its own right. Either way, you can kind of see what I'm getting at for this video, is that green-black is your graveyard synergy deck, and then you might branch into another color one way or another for white or blue depending on if you have some of the payoffs, because there are other gold payoffs here. There's Eerie Ultimatum, which is your Abzan colored ultimatum. It's white, white, black, 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 green, green. So again, very heavy on black, but you do need to get that double white in there somehow, meaning this card's not very easy to splash, but it's got a very good effect, right? Of all the ultimatums, this one is potentially the splashiest of them all. It says return any number of permanent cards with different names from your graveyard to the battlefield. So where we just got over saying Nethroi is kind of busted for returning, 2, 3, 4 creatures back to the graveyard, Eerie Ultimatum returns all of your creatures from the graveyard to the battlefield, and in addition just puts any other permanents that might have been milled or any other things that might have died, been destroyed, artifacts, enchantments, they just all come back to the battlefield, which is a huge effect to have. Basically game-winning effect for Limited in any normal game of Limited. There's no ways to really exile graveyards or just repeatedly exile cards from graveyards unless you're doing it yourself. So Eerie Ultimatum, if you can swing the double white mana, should be just a huge payoff. But you still need black, 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 green, green to cast this, right? It's not free to put this even in your Abzan deck. There are going to be times where you have 7 mana and you just are missing a specific color. So keep that in mind with all the ultimatums. They are extremely powerful. You should be playing them. You might want to go out of your way to splash them, but you do need to make sure that you can actually cast them. Mythos of Brokos is another rare worth talking about here. It's 2 green green for a rare sorcery that says return up to 2 permanent cards from your graveyard to your hand. So for 4 mana, at sorcery speed, you get to regrowth 2 of your permanents from your graveyard, which is not bad. 4 mana is decent casting cost for this sort of effect, right? It's basically green's graveyard version of a draw 2, and you get to pick the permanent, so you're always getting good cards back, right? Now, it has that extra little Mythos clause, making it more of a Sultai card here than a mono green card. It says, if blue-black was spent to cast this card, search your library for a card, put that card into your graveyard, and then shuffle, and you do that before you choose the permanents to put back in your hand. So, if you pay green, green, blue, black to cast this card, you get to search for a card, put it in your graveyard first, and then get 2 cards back from your graveyard to your hand. Note, you can only get permanents back, so don't go searching for your best instant or sorcery and putting it in the graveyard, because that will not work. And this essentially turns into a Diabolic Tutor plus a regrowth if you're able to pay the extra mana, right? It's very heavy green. You would still probably play this in most of your green graveyard-based decks and be fairly happy with it. You're probably black if you care about your graveyard a lot, and you can easily splash for blue in this set if the payoff for this is enough, right? Mythos of Brokos is a very powerful card if you get to pull it off for the full 4 colored mana, but it does require that you get that blue mana in there. And then there is a 3-color card that we want to talk about here called Death's Oasis. It's Abzan colored mana, so white, black, green for an enchantment that says, whenever a non-token creature you control dies, put the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard, and then return a creature card with a lesser converted mana cost than the creature that died from your graveyard to your hand. So pretty simple to understand, right? If a 3-drop creature died, then you mill yourself for 2, and then you can get a 1 or 2 drop back from your graveyard to your hand. And this scales up, right? If a 6-drop died, you get to mill yourself for 2, and then get anything that costs 1 to 5 back from your graveyard to your hand. So you get to kind of cascade your creatures from the graveyard over and over again, and every time you do, you get another creature back, which can turn into another creature, and you get to mill yourself, right? So this sets up your graveyard very nicely. It mills every time a creature dies, and it's not optional, so you could potentially go too far and mill yourself out, but it's a huge engine to just keep looping creatures, right? And it's hard to go up the scale. You do need to make sure you have a nice curve of creatures to really get a huge benefit off of this. But if you have value creatures that don't mind going to the graveyard, this can actually do a lot of work. Now, it has an activated ability here that says, for 1 mana, sacrifice it, gain life equal to the greatest converted mana cost among creatures you control. That's not really a big thing, but what I imagine that's there for is so that you can sacrifice it and get it off the board to stop yourself from milling out. Again, you don't have to, or you can't choose not to put 2 cards in the graveyard when one of your creature dies. So if your creatures are dying too much, you might get to the point where you actually mill yourself out, and this has a sacrifice effect that can get it off the board and prevent yourself from doing that. And finally, I wanted to talk about Titan's Nest, which is very similar. It's a Sultai card that cares about the graveyard. It's one of the rare enchantments. Every 3-color combination got a rare enchantment. In this case, Abzan and Sultai both got enchantments that care about the graveyard. But Titan's Nest is still pretty cool. Probably not that good for limited, though. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, look at the top card of your library. You may put that card into your graveyard. So this is working twofold, right? It helps you kind of control what you're drawing, give you a little bit more action, right? If you've got plenty of lands, you can just keep ditching lands to the graveyard and hopefully draw spells. In addition to that, you get to fill up your graveyard while you're doing that. Now, the real power of this card comes in the activated ability that says exile a card from your graveyard, add colorless mana to your mana pool, spend it only to cast colored spells without X in its mana cost. So we don't need to worry about that stipulation too much. This is more for constructed purposes to prevent you from turning your entire graveyard into mana. But that's what this does. The easy shorthand for people who understand it is that this gives all the cards in your hand delve. Every card in your graveyard can be used for mana to cast the colored spells in your hand, which is pretty powerful effect, but in limited, not really worth a card, right? Unless you're trying to cast 9 drops in this set, which is a possibility, or your deck is just super expensive. Every single card in your deck costs like 3 or 4 generic mana, then you probably don't need Titan's Nest. It's not the most efficient way to fill up the graveyard. It's not the best way of using the graveyard, and playing it to kind of control your top deck is not really worth it either. So while I appreciate the design of this card, it's not enough for me to want to splash blue and go into a whole third color, and I don't think the payoff's really here when it comes to limited. So we talked about some of the rare cards that would push you into a third color, but let's go ahead and focus back on green-black here, and we're going to talk about cards that actually get the job rolling, like get things rolling by putting cards into your graveyard. Obviously, this will just naturally happen through the course of the game, but there are plenty of cards that can mill yourself for value. Might even give you an extra little benefit on top of it. The first here is Corpse Churn, which is a reprint that says 1 in a black, instant, put the top 3 cards of your library into your graveyard, and then return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So this is working a little bit double time, right? It puts a couple cards in your graveyard. It also gives you a creature back. I prefer to play Corpse Churn when I already have a creature that I want to get back from my graveyard to my hand. That way I'm not just blindly flipping and hoping I hit a creature that's worth putting back in my hand. But you can do worse than Corpse Churn. It's a raised dead effect, which tend to be pretty good in sets where you have valuable creatures, which there are a lot of really good creatures in this set. Corpse Churn should be fine. It also gives you the extra 2 cards on top of the card that you're getting back to your hand, so you can fill up your graveyard pretty nicely with this. I wouldn't go hog wild and draft a bunch of Corpse Churns, but if I'm in a graveyard deck, I'll value it a little bit highly. There's Dark Bargain. Again, not really a Graveyard Matters card, but has a little bit of synergy. Dark Bargain is 4 mana for an instant that lets you look at the top 3 cards of your library. You put 2 of them in your hand, you put 1 in the graveyard, and you deal 2 damage to yourself. But that's fine, right? This lets you set up a card in the graveyard, right? If I have a card that wants to go to the graveyard and I can get value off that, then I'm just going to ditch that to the graveyard and draw my other 2 cards. Dark Bargain, again, is more of just a raw draw spell. Raw card advantage card for black that has a tiny little bit of upside of putting an extra card in the graveyard. We have Skull Prophet, which is one of the gold uncommons for Golgari. It's black-green for a 3/1 uncommon human druid and has 2 abilities. It can either tap to add black or green, so it's a mana dork on a 3/1, which is interesting, or it can tap to put the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard. So you can tap it to kind of start milling yourself and getting the train rolling, right? 3 mana 3/1 that can act as a mana dork, already pretty versatile. It can trade off in combat, it can attack, or you can use it to kind of ramp into your stronger plays a little bit earlier. Or once you get to the point where you don't need the mana, you don't necessarily need to leave this on defense, you can start activating it to put cards in your graveyard and fill it up pretty quickly. And there's Excavation Mole, which is just a solid creature that people will play in their green decks, but it fits pretty nicely in the graveyard deck. It's 2 and a green for a 3/3 with trample. It's a common, and it says when it enters the battlefield, put the top 3 cards of your library into your graveyard. Again, this is a green creature with trample, so there will be other people who are interested in this. It's a good statted creature. It's just a vanilla common, and if the Graveyard Matters synergy comes up, you will want this card a little bit more, but just keep in mind this isn't the type of thing that'll be wheeling like a Corpse Churn. Other people will be interested in Excavation Mole. Now, there's also a couple rares and a couple other gold cards worth talking about. One of them is Gyruda, Doom of Depths. This is 4 and double Dimir hybrid mana, so 6 mana total. 2 of it has to be at least blue or black, and it's a 6/6 legendary Demon Kraken. It has some companion clause, we're not going to worry about that here because it's not relevant to what we're talking about, but it does have companion. And it says, when it enters the battlefield, each player puts the top 4 cards of their library into their graveyard, put a creature card with an even converted mana cost from among those onto the battlefield under your control. So this is a little bit hit or miss, right? Obviously, the companion clause pushes you towards wanting even costed creatures, but you don't necessarily have to go all in for companion here. Garuda has a pretty good shot of milling 8 cards and giving you at least something to choose from, if not just one creature that has an even converted mana cost, and it already adds a 6 mana 6/6 to the board, right? So if this ever hits, you get to add 2 creatures to the board, one of which is already a pretty decent vanilla creature. Note that this is a little bit awkward with the graveyard deck because you have to get a creature from among the cards that were milled with Garuda. You don't get to pick a creature that's already in the graveyard when you cast Garuda. It's one of the cards that Garuda's ability actually put into the graveyard. And even though this has blue in its mana cost, keep in mind that's hybrid mana. You can just cast this for 4 black. So don't think that you have to move into Sultai if you're in a graveyard deck and you have Garuda in your pool. There's also Fiend Artisan, which is kind of in that middle ground where it's both an enabler and a payoff card. It's a really awkward mythic. It has a bunch of strong abilities, but it's just kind of like ability soup, if you will. Fiend Artisan is double black-green hybrid mana for a 1/1, so any combination of 2 black or green mana for a 1/1. Mythic Nightmare, and it gets +1/+1 for each creature card in your graveyard, so there's your kind of payoff ability, right? This thing gets bigger as the game goes on. Cards like this tend to be just okay and limited, but if you can really turbo creatures into your graveyard, it can get out of hand pretty quickly. It also has an activated ability, X and a hybrid black-green mana, so 1 green or black mana plus X. Tap it, sack another creature, that's a lot of costs. Search your library for a creature card with converted mana cost X or less, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. Activate it only as a sorcery. So that's an easy way to get a creature in the graveyard and turn that creature into value, right? It doesn't matter what you sacrifice. The converted mana cost of the creature you're sacrificing isn't what is taken into account here. This isn't a Vannifar or Neoform type card. The X is the converted mana cost of the creature you're going to search up, and you do have to tap the Fiend Artisan and sacrifice any other creature just to activate that ability. So it basically lets you dump extra mana and creatures you don't care about sacrificing on board into whatever you're able to search up from your library. Fiend Artisan, one of those cards where if I had it in my pool and I plan on activating it, I would probably make a short list of creatures that are worth fetching up with its ability, just so I don't have to constantly remember and think about what I can fetch. But it's a nice little graveyard card. It puts creatures in the graveyard, obviously, because it sacrifices them. It can kind of chain those creatures together if they have good death triggers or enter the battlefield triggers, and it gets bigger the entire time because it gets +1/+1 for each creature in your graveyard. There's also 2 cycling creatures I wanted to talk about here, and this is going to apply to off-color cycling creatures as well, but these are the 2 big ones. Void Beckoner, Titanoth Rex. They are an 8/8 Death Touch and an 11/11 Trample, respectively, and they have these cycling clauses, but the important part here is, yeah, you can cast these cards if you have the mana, but a lot of times you'll end up cycling them because they are super expensive to cast. The thing is, these are the big fatties that are worth reanimating in the set to really cheat things out. The dream in this set is to cycle a Titanoth Rex and then use one of the reanimation abilities to put it back on the battlefield for 4 or 5 mana instead of for the full 9 mana. So just keep that in mind, that creatures with cycling, A, are just generally easier to get into the graveyard for things that care about creatures in the graveyard, and B, these are kind of the biggest of the big creatures that you can get at uncommon, at least outside of the rares. And that pushes us into the different portion of the graveyard deck. In one case, you want to know how to get creatures into your graveyard. You want to know what the payoffs are. These are the cards that are going to get those creatures back out of the graveyard or give you some sort of benefit for having milled them over or having reanimation spells in your deck in the first place. One that's worth mentioning here, but I don't think is going to be very good, is Durable Coil Bug. It's 1 and a black for a 2/2 common insect, so 2 mana 2/2, kind of whatever in this set. And it has activated ability, 4 and a black, return it from your graveyard to your hand. Very expensive to activate that, doesn't even put it on the battlefield tapped or anything like that. So this is an extremely slow engine, about as slow as you can imagine for a common like this. 7 mana to go through the full iteration of casting this. Having it block or trade off with something, 5 mana to put it back in your hand and then keep looping that, right? It's not a very sustainable engine unless you're in the extreme late game. If you want to use this for any sort of effect that you need to sacrifice creatures for, it's a tiny little benefit that you can get it back to your hand. It's also not necessarily the worst thing in the world if you mill over this card with a thing like Corpse Churn, but it's not exactly the best payoff you can get here, just something I wanted to mention. There's Survivor's Bond, which is 1 and a green for a common sorcery. It says choose one or both, return target human creature from your graveyard to your hand, or return target non-human creature from your graveyard to your hand. Now, more often than not, you're in green. There are not that many humans in green, which we'll talk about in the next video. I think there's maybe 2 and then some gold cards, maybe 3 and some gold cards. So it's not too hard to get a non-human creature from your graveyard to your hand, but if you want the full benefit of this card, then I would probably go out of my way to include a few humans. They can be the black humans, they can be green humans, they can be whatever. Just as long as you're getting both cards back off of Survivor's Bond, it's pretty strong. If you're using this to only get a single creature back, it gets much, much weaker and is basically just worse than Corpse Churn at that point. Call of the Death Dweller is quite good. It's 2 and a black for a uncommon sorcery, and it says return up to 2 creature cards with total converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Put a Death Touch counter on either of them, then put a Menace counter on either of them. So this is a little bit versatile. There are 2 different modes. You can either get back a 1-drop and a 2-drop. Total mana cost 3, in which case you can put a Death Touch counter on probably the 1-drop and a Menace counter on probably the 2-drop, or you can double up, put a Menace and Death Touch counter on one of those creatures. But you can also use Call of the Death Dweller to just get back a 3 mana cost creature and use it as a 1-for-1. That creature will come back with both Death Touch and Menace, which is actually a very strong combination of abilities. It's a nice way to get small creatures out of your graveyard. It's never going to reanimate your Titanoth Rexes or your Void Beckoners, but it is a good, efficient reanimation spell for smaller creatures, and I would definitely look to pick it up if you saw it while you're drafting the graveyard deck. There's also 2 cards that you are using to bring back your big fatties. These are kind of your almost game finisher type reanimation spells where you're getting back something huge, or at least that's ideally what you want to do. The first one and the weaker of the 2 is Unbreakable Bond. It's 4 and a black for an uncommon sorcery. Return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a lifelink counter on it. So 5 mana, sorcery speed, reanimation. We're very much used to this at this point. Bond of Revival from War of the Spark, Cauldron's Gift from Throne of Eldraine, Rise from the Dark Realms from M19 and other sets. It's just very standard. The problem, of course, being that this only takes creatures out of your own graveyard, whereas I tend to like when these cards can target creatures from anyone's graveyard. That way, you can play it in a non-reanimation dedicated deck by just killing your opponent's best creatures and reanimating those. But when it only takes a creature out of your graveyard, it does make you go out of the way to make sure you have creatures worth reanimating, right? But it gives you an extra little benefit as well. You get to put lifelink on that creature, and hopefully you're using Unbreakable Bond to bring back a pretty beefy creature, otherwise it's really not worth it. The key to the cards like this is you want to reanimate something that is worth at least the casting cost of what you spent to cast the reanimation spell. I'm spending 5 mana to cast this, so I want to get back something that's worth at least 5 or more mana. That means I can just reanimate a 5-drop, give it lifelink, and be reasonably happy, or I can go all the way up to the Titanoth Rex and bring back my 11/11 Trampler with lifelink and be extremely happy. Now, the better of the 2 cards here is Back for More, which is actually an extremely powerful card. It is 4 black-green for an uncommon instant, so pretty expensive, 2 colors. Obviously, we're going to get a better effect here. It says return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, so same deal, doesn't target your opponent's creatures, only targets your stuff, but does so at instant speed, so you get kind of like this surprise factor in combat that you wouldn't have with a card like Unbreakable Bond. And it has an extra little benefit. It says when you do, it fights up to 1 target creature you don't control. So not only do you get to reanimate a creature, but you get a fight attached to that creature as well. And you can choose whether or not you want to fight. You don't have to. That means Back for More, being an instant, having the fight attached, has the potential to be a complete 3-for-1 in the middle of combat, right? Your opponent's attacking you with a couple creatures, you cast Back for More, you have the enter the battlefield, fight off a small creature, and then you block as well. And if you get to keep the creature, you got the full 3-for-1 off this card. Pretty powerful for an uncommon. Again, really requires that you have big creatures worth getting back. If Back for More is just reanimating a 3/3 and then using that to block, it's a little bit expensive to do that. You might get a 2-for-1 off of this. In fact, you will very often get a 2-for-1 off of Back for More. Getting the full 3-for-1 is a little bit harder, but it's a strong card. It is exactly the reanimation spell you want if you have giant fatties in your deck, which there are plenty of in this format, and it's leaps and bounds better than Unbreakable Bond. But Unbreakable Bond will do the trick if you're trying to get your Titanoth Rex or Void Beckoner back on the battlefield. Also wanted to mention Necropanther and its friend Boneyard Lurker. These are two mutate creatures that have reanimation style effects attached to them. Necropanther is 1 white-black. Again, has that white mana in there, but the mutate cost is 2 and double Orzhov hybrid mana, so you could actually pay 2 black to mutate this and never actually have to worry about the white mana in the casting cost, although it's worth having a 1 or 2 white sources in your deck just so you have the option to cast Necropanther. But what do you get if you mutate? Well, if you don't, you get a 3 mana 3/3, and that's just fine. If you do mutate, it says whenever this creature mutates, return target creature with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So again, kind of small reanimation, right? Get something small back from the graveyard to the battlefield, hopefully something you got value off of, or something you traded, or something you just incidentally milled. Remember, Necropanther mutating means that you are basically going down a creature to mutate, right? You're basically cannibalizing a creature so that Necropanther's ability will trigger, in which case you then get a creature back. So I do like that Necropanther has built-in card advantage, or at least card parity. You go down a creature to mutate, but you're up a creature from your graveyard, and it seems like a decent exchange. Again, don't go heavy on white here, or don't go out of your way to be a black-white deck. You still want to be green-black if you have Necropanther, but Necropanther seems like a decent card, and potentially an engine if you have a bunch of ways to continue to mutate onto it. Boneyard Lurker is a little bit more versatile, but doesn't put the cards on the battlefield. It is 2 black-green for a 4/4, so a 4 mana 4/4, also quite good. The mutate cost is also 4 mana, but it includes hybrid mana, so 2 colorless and at least, or rather 2 black-green hybrid mana, 4 total, to either cast this or mutate it. And whenever this one mutates, you return target permanent from your graveyard to your hand. So while Necropanther puts a small creature directly onto the battlefield from the graveyard, Bone Lurker lets you get anything, not necessarily just small converted mana cost 3 or less, but that permanent has to go back to your hand, which you can then recast, right? Makes it kind of a Gravedigger type effect, but more versatile. You don't mind playing Boneyard Lurker out as just a 4 mana 4/4. That's quite powerful, but if you can mutate onto this, you get a card's worth of advantage back, which, similar to Necropanther, makes up for the 2-for-1 nature of mutate. And these cards are both quite strong, even though, again, I want to be as heavy green-black graveyard deck as possible if I have either of them, regardless of the white mana in Necropanther's mana cost. And finally, there is Lyris of the Dream Den, another companion. This one costs 1 and double Orzhov mana, so no green at all, but keep in mind the hybrid mana means you can play this card for 1 black-black. You do not have to have white anywhere in your green-black deck for Lyris to be castable. You can just treat it as a double black card and it'll work just fine. If you're in white-black, you're definitely playing this card, but if you care a lot about the graveyard's energy, you might be able to play this in your green-black deck and be happy with it. Now, again, companion doesn't matter here. It's not even really achievable in limited, so we're going to go ahead and gloss over that. But what you get for your 1 black-black or your 1 and white-black or what have you is a rare Cat Nightmare. It's a 3/2 with a lifelink, 3 mana 3/2 lifelink. Perfectly fine card, but it has a very powerful ability. It says, during each of your turns, you may cast 1 permanent spell with converted mana cost 2 or less from your graveyard. So your 1s and 2 drops, as long as they're permanent, you can just cast them out of your graveyard. Now, it does say cast, so you can't play lands, but you get to basically loop your 1s and 2 drops. So there are times where you can set up engines by having some sort of sacrifice effect, which we didn't really mention in this video, and something that doesn't mind dying. Anything with a death trigger that's really cheap, or anything that can trade off for value. Maybe your little death touch creatures that you are just using to brick wall your opponent has to trade off for those eventually. So being able to trade one off and then play Lyris and get a 1 or 2 drop death touch creature back seems very powerful to me. It's just a nice little engine. It is very restrictive on what you can actually get back, but it shouldn't be too hard to find things that you can loop with Lyris. You only get to do the ability once per turn, but that's fine. Very powerful card nonetheless, and keep in mind you do not have to be playing white to play this in your graveyard deck. And that's going to go ahead and do a little bit shorter of a video, but we wanted to go ahead and make the videos a little bit shorter since the first couple went on for quite a while. The final video in this series, I believe, final video, is going to be about humans and the human synergies in white black, and then also the non-human matters cards, which I find very annoying, but something we should talk about nonetheless. So again, if this has been helpful in any way, shape, or form, if you just like the sound of me droning on and on and on with a monotone voice for about 20 to 30 to 40 minutes, feel free to subscribe below because we have plenty of that here. Or find us on Twitter at MTG_ManaRocks. I hope you guys have fun with your graveyard decks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.